Hello, class. Today we're going to go over some notes over chapters 1 through 12 of Fight Club. We won't go into extreme detail, but there are a couple of points per chapter that I'd like to go over. You want to make sure that you watch the introduction to Fight Club video if you haven't already, because that discusses some key themes and concepts that you're going to need to know in order for this very strange text to make sense. So, without further ado, let's get into it. All right. So chapter number 1, we begin at the end. We have this image of an unnamed narrator at the top of a building interacting with a character named Tyler Durden. We know that there's some kind of uh, terroristic plot going on that's dubbed Project Mayhem. Now, Project Mayhem does not show up in the novel for some time, but we start at the end, so we kind of know where we're going to come from. And this is a really smart tactic on Palahniuk's part because he shows you where it's going so that you understand the severity of the narrator's transformation. Because in the next chapter, he's just some loser working an awful job. So how do we get here? How do we get to this crazy moment with this insane person waving a gun around and threatening to blow up buildings and all this stuff? It's a very interesting way to start things. So there is a fundamental question that I think is posed by this novel, and it's one of the reasons why I assign it, because I think we're going through a period of civil unrest in the United States. The severity of that remains to be seen, but from what we can tell, there are some people in our society, and really in any society, that have the desire to tear everything down, to break society down and destroy it. And my question is, and the question really posited by Fight Club is, why would anyone want to do that? Specifically men, what causes them to feel like rebelling against the society through destructive or violent means? Why would you feel like tearing everything down would be better for you? And so that's really the reason, because I think Fight Club is very smart. It examines, being a postmodern novel, it is very deconstructionist in nature. So it picks apart our society and examines all of the ugly underbelly of our consumer society that we've created. And it gives some pretty compelling reasons for why people would be experiencing a level of alienation that would compel them to do crazy things, right? Um, and that's kind of, people don't really like that, because when we see crazy things happening, we kind of just want it to be monsters, like, oh yeah, a crazy person did something crazy. What if that's not really the case, though? What if some of this stuff is social in nature in terms of its cause? So that's an interesting idea. Now, after that wild chapter 1, we get into chapter 2, where we have this narrator that is suffering from insomnia. We know that he works a menial job and that he doesn't really have any meaning in his life. He doesn't have any relationships. He doesn't have any prospects. He goes to work every day to work as a recall coordinator for a major auto company. A recall coordinator is somebody who makes the decision whether or not to do a recall, meaning buy all of the automobiles back, or to pay the families of people when things go wrong, which usually involves loss of life. So it's kind of a job that is really like, it makes the narrator a parasite, basically, a blemish on society. The thing he does for a living is a detriment to the livelihood of his fellow human beings. We get Big Bob and remaining men together. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to look up the scene from the movie about Big Bob, because it is pretty funny, really. It stars Meatloaf, who recently passed away, but he plays Big Bob, or Robert Paulson's. Big Bob was a bodybuilder, and the support groups that the narrator is attending are for people who have gone through major illnesses, like life-threatening illnesses. And the narrator himself is not sick. He goes to these support groups because his life is so devoid of feeling that he goes to experience a catharsis so that he can actually feel something, anything at all, right? So he's at Remaining Men Together, which is a group for testicular cancer, very nasty stuff. And Big Bob is a figure who really wrought his illness upon himself because he was a bodybuilder and he used steroids, and steroids are cancer causing. And so he's a very tragic character in this way. he used to be the embodiment of the perfect body image for men, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You could never become Arnold Schwarzenegger unless you took steroids, right? So it's not a reasonable body expectation. But people look at images of Arnold and other people and they think, that's what I'm supposed to look like. I don't look like that. So I have to do all of these crazy things so that I can look like that. And in this case, Bob really took it really far. He used like stuff they use on race horses and stuff, hormones and things to try to get his ideal body. And it cost him his masculinity. He, because his certain organs were removed as a consequence of the cancer, he's actually growing breasts as a consequence because the body's trying to balance out the hormones. So he's literally a feminized character that used to be the embodiment of masculine perfection. That is intentional on the part of Palahniuk. He's trying to show you the tragic problems with these ideals that we have in society about what men should look like and what men should do. And if you can't live up to that, you have to do crazy and often self-destructive things to try to maintain that image. And Bob is the example of that. So why does the narrator go to these support groups? It seems like a really like voyeuristic and sick thing to do. But the reason he does it is because he has no feeling in his life, none. He is very much a product of the corporate environment, and he doesn't even know why he has proceeded to the point that he has. We do have a mention of Marla Singer at this point in time, although we don't get much information about her. We know that she is the focus of the speaker's ire because why would she be in a testicular cancer group? She doesn't have that. So she is a faker like him, and she kind of exposes him. And that, I think, is important to note. What is his deal with Marla? Why does he hate Marla so much? That's part of it. Another part of it is Marla represents the intrusion of women into traditionally masculine spaces. The Big Bob and Remaining Men Together place is traditionally masculine, like only men would be there. So for her to be there, it represents this, what some men would feel is an intrusion on the part of women into the workforce and things like that, and the anxiety that it creates, showing them really to be fairly small in their thinking and in their sort of attitude towards women. Also, the interaction with the doctor, I think, is worthy of note because the doctor doesn't take his condition seriously, even though, as we later find out, this is a pretty sick guy. And so I think there's some commentary there, albeit very subtle, about a failure of the medical system to diagnose someone that has a severe issues, several severe issues. Okay, that's chapter 2. Chapter 3. This is when we first meet Tyler Durden, who is a hyper-eccentric character. He seems unbound by the same mental trappings that the narrator suffers, and the narrator has no name. I also think that is intentional. So Tyler Durden is like everything the narrator wishes he could be. He's a person who lives by his own wit and will and doesn't answer to anyone. He's also a kind of a lunatic. He does crazy things, and in his rebellion against society, he is willing to do anything which society deems as wrong, and some of that is wrong for a reason, right? That's the problem with Tyler. They meet on a nude beach, which is really weird. Like, what's up with that? Maybe a little bit of homoerotic implications there. I'm not sure. But they meet on a nude beach, and they become friends. Of course, in the film, they meet on an airplane. So, and Tyler is this very mischievous person. He works at a movie theater, and he splices obscene images into the reel of the movie screen so that people will be subjected subliminally to obscene things like pornographic images and stuff like that. And so this is like this weird, perverse vandalism. And you have to ask, why is a grown man committing acts of vandalism? When you think about vandalism, you think about teenagers and egging houses and, bashing mailboxes and that kind of thing. You don't expect this behavior from a grown man, and if a grown man is exhibiting this behavior, it is some form of commentary on his ability to reach a state of maturation. Tyler is very immature, as is the narrator. They are like man children, basically. adult boys. And why? What has left these men in a state of immaturity and juvenile behavior? There's a fragmentation in the narrative. This is so we have an unreliable narrator who's basically stream of consciousness. He jumps all over the place. You get big breaks in time and place. You know, there's that whole thing with you wake up in SeaTac, you wake up at LAX, you wake up in these airports. And that's meant to kind of convolute the narrative a little bit. It's in the postmodern vein of having the modern and postmodern vein of having a what's the term I'm looking for? Of having like an erratic narrative, like and a untrustworthy narrator. So remember, postmodernism is really trying to convey things that are not traditionally valued in literature as being valuable. So whereas before you would expect like a very straight story, this happened and this happened and this happened, postmodernism gives you, basically puts you inside the mind of a crazy person and shows you how erratic and spontaneous that is. And there's a reason for that, because that is apparently how some people think, right? They have this erratic thinking style that exists in the universe, and yet books have never addressed it. So that's one good thing that this novel does. Okay, chapter 4. So this is the confrontation of Marla, where he like works himself up and he goes and he gives Marla a hug, but when he goes in for the hug, he accuses her of being a faker, and she gets the better of him in this conversation, which shows you that this character is completely emasculated. We see this over and over again. He loses his masculinity and he's pushed into a sense of inferiority, which is probably compelling him to do the things that he does. They get in an argument about who gets what support group and why. Marla's motivation for attending the support groups is that she wants to be close to death, which is different from the narrator's motivation. He wants a catharsis, any sort of feeling at all, but she wants to be close to death, and she's like a kind of like a sick voyeur or tourist. She wants to watch these people in their most desperate state because she gets a kick out of it. And when he confronts her on splitting the group, she's really like, no, I'm not going to give you that one. I'll take this one instead. You can have this. She takes charge of the situation, which, of course, it flies in the face of his sense of masculinity. And so they have that interaction, and we start to see that she becomes a fixation. Even though the narrator really plays down his fixation on Marla, she is the object of all of his thoughts, right? And that is intentional. Chapter 5, and we are moving kind of quick, folks, but I assume you've already read this stuff, so we're just pointing out some key takeaways that we want to think about. So chapter 5 has the issue with the vibrating luggage. The clerk implies that the luggage may be vibrating because it contains a certain sex toy, which is mentioned. This, of course, is speculative. It's actually his electric razor. But again, it's more of this continuity of the theme of emasculation, of having his masculinity or his manliness taken away from him, even through implication from others. It doesn't actually have to be based on anything real. This is also when the narrator's apartment mysteriously blows up, causing him the loss of his material possessions. Fight Club is an excellent critique, or offers an excellent critique on consumer culture. Consumer culture is, I think, grotesque to some degree. You only need to look at like the plastic island in the Pacific, or some other thing like that, to realize that probably the way that we go through and the way that we consume things is a little bit excessive. So we have to ask, what happened with this? Is this an accident? Did Tyler do this? Did someone else do this? Is this an extreme rejection of material culture? I think so. I think that's what it's about. And if you remember, in the film, there's a great scene about the IKEA nesting instinct, and it talks about how the narrator would just go through IKEA catalogs and pick out furniture and just buy stuff just to buy it, and he was trying to complete himself by buying these things. Our society does tell us that. If you want to be complete, all you need is the new Apple Watch. if you want to have a good life, all you need is an iPad and a Ferrari and all this other crap. And it creates a sense of inferiority. It creates a sense of incompleteness. It creates a motivation to participate in this insane consumption. And on some level, I think the destruction of the apartment is representative of the rejection of consumerism. Now, of course, it's an extreme rejection. If you reject consumerism, you don't have to give up having things. But this is the length to which it's taken in the novel, because that's the way that these people cope with these things. They have real legitimate gripes about society, but the way that they deal with it is through such an extreme, just overblown way, that it almost makes them kind of a comical foil of the society itself, like a doppelganger. It's very weird. Whatever the society does, they don't do in the extreme. So his mysterious reactions to this incident contribute to the unreliable narrator trope. We get the feeling that he may have done this himself. There's some implication that he may have done this himself by the apartment attendant and stuff. We don't really know at this point, but it is strange that he doesn't, like, he's not completely devastated. We can imagine, if your home or apartment exploded and you lost everything you owned, you wouldn't react by nonchalantly calling your new friend Tyler on the phone and going to move in with him and just acting like nothing happened. That is a very bizarre reaction. Chapter 6. So Fight Club has started by chapter 6, and we get kind of some information about what it is while the narrator is at work. It is a secret group for men to just fight each other. Fighting is the whole point of it. The first rule is you can't talk about it, so I've already broken that with these videos. And the narrator advocates for self-destruction as a way for him to fix his problems, which is bizarre. Why self-destruction? What can possibly be gained from self-destruction? What can be gained from violence? Maybe there are things that can be gained. Maybe you can gain knowledge of yourself and your abilities and stuff like that, and you can gain skill in overpowering people and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it seems like self-destruction is kind of counterintuitive. And yet, again, it's an extreme reaction. Society says you should preserve yourself until you're 104 or whatever, Betty White age. No, she didn't make it to 100. That's right. But you have to go as long as you can and preserve yourself and all this stuff. And I think, again, it's an extreme rejection. Oh, society says I have to preserve myself? Well, I'll destroy myself then. And that's what's really good, right? That's really bizarre to me. And I think that can be unpacked a little bit further as the novel goes on. So the theme of the absentee father arises, and now we start to understand why it is that these men never grew up. They don't have any father figures to model a sense of masculinity on, so their sense of masculinity is based on what they think maleness should be, and that is violent and dominant and all this other stuff. It's not, there's a whole missing part of the masculine paradigm that they are unaware of because they have absentee fathers. And so that's why they're like little boys, basically. They are also sort of, there's a commentary here about how men aren't really abiding by masculine duties. Again, gender roles are complicated. They are largely prescribed. But one of the roles that men are supposed to have in a positive sense is that they're supposed to be like stoic, but, stoic and stern, but nurturing in a way. And they're supposed to help their sons and daughters become competent, strong, smart people. Since they have been denied this from their own fathers, there's a commentary there on maybe men not doing their duty in some way and abandoning their duty in pursuit of trivial things. Fight Club starts to gain more members, which means somebody's breaking the first rule. Is that a commentary on the arbitrary nature of laws or a juvenile rejection of the rules? I'm not going to follow the rules, man. Hard to say, but you have a lot more people showing up, and it's like this thing is getting pretty volatile and out of hand, this group. At the end of this chapter, chapter 6, the narrator calls his father and talks to him about what he should do in his life. His father first, he never went to college, so he says, well, you should go to college. So he goes to college and he gets out. And he's like, now what? And he's like, well, get married. And it's like he's just going through these steps of what society expects him to do. But he doesn't really know why he's doing it. It isn't really what he wants. He's not pursuing his own sense of worth and what he values. He's pursuing what society tells him to value. And this again is a commentary. If you think back to the previous video, there's a commentary on Freud and the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego is the socially imposed notion of what you should be doing or how you should be acting. The ego is the conscious self. The id is the subconscious self. So it's like there's a subconscious self, a conscious self, and a social self. The social self is the superego, and he's just going by what the superego is telling him to do. But is it what he really needs or wants? No, because he ends up in a job that he hates, in a life he doesn't stand, in complete alienation, and just pursuing meaningless material acquisition as a way to entertain himself. So the Fight Club started in a parking lot, and Tyler asked him to hit him as hard as he can. And when he hits him, he imagines he was hitting his father. So the absentee father thing is constantly there. Now, when he goes back to work after the advent of Fight Club, we see him start to transform. So the transformation is beginning to occur, and we're starting to see the incremental changes in his behavior. He's in the work environment, and he's still part of it, but he's starting to become detached from it. And he's starting to become another thing entirely himself. Okay. The end of chapter 7, we have Marla's suicide attempt. So obviously she has some kind of mental illness, and she attempts to kill herself by eating too many Xanax, which is like a mood stabilizer, very addictive and dangerous in high doses. And she tries to kill herself, and the narrator says this would have been a good thing, but Tyler happened to answer the phone and hear her and went over to save her, and ends up romantically involved. They start a sexual relationship, and the narrator's reaction is one of complete jealousy. But he acts like he's jealous of Marla for getting to Tyler. It's really he really, the narrator loves Marla. He's obsessed with her, but he won't admit it to himself, and he has to act like she's nothing, or she's trash, or she's beneath him, as a way to cope with his feelings of inferiority. Marla's self-deprecation, she refers to herself as human garbage. During their sexual encounters with her and Tyler, there's a lot of like derogatory stuff, degradation, just really ugly. And that's kind of weird. Like, why do they embrace the fact that they're garbage? Why do they like flaunt being human garbage? Again, I think it's part of that rebellion against the society. Oh, you say I'm garbage? Fine, I'm garbage. I love being garbage. What are you going to do about it? So it's kind of weird how they embrace that, right? Chapter 8, now we start to see he's really disconnecting from work. He's coming to work like with blood all over him and beat up, and he gets sent home for blood on his pants. Tyler and Marla continue their relationship to the narrator's dismay, but he never sees them in the same room together, which is very strange. And it is in chapter 8 where Tyler begins to make soap. And the soap is an interesting sign in the story. Like, what does the soap mean? He refers to it as the yardstick to civilization at one point. And between chapter 8 and 9 is the Tyler's kiss scene, where Tyler starts to talk to him about hitting rock bottom and letting go and accepting the idea of death. And then in chapter 9, or at the end of chapter 8, he dumps something called lye onto a kiss that he put on his hand. And when lye and moisture are mixed, it creates like a really, really hot burn. It burns at hundreds of degrees, and so it like sears this flesh wound in the back of the narrator's hand. And Tyler is standing over him and telling him about enlightenment and embracing his pain and embracing his death, and human sacrifice. He mentions is how soap was created, which isn't true, by the way. He says this whole thing about how when the Celts used to burn sacrifices, the fat would mix with the lye from the fire, and it would wash into the river, and it would create soap. And people who cleaned their clothes in that part of the river would notice that the clothes were more clean than they usually are, and that's how soap was created. Soap is actually way more important than we in the modern time give it credit. Without soap, you would be very uncomfortable right now. You'd have all sorts of skin infections and stuff like that. Disease would be much more rampant. There's a chance that some of us wouldn't even be here because there's no soap. So it is an interesting symbol. It's seemingly non-important and kind of ordinary, but it has this great cultural significance in terms of its ability to allow us to live not only comfortably, but to live at all in the face of some very dangerous bacteria. So I think it's a good way. It's also a front for his bomb making stuff, because a lot of the stuff that they use to make those kinds of things is also used in the production of soap. So it's like a front, a cover. And there's this whole bit about enlightenment, and enlightenment being to accept death and accept self-destruction. It's like the rejection of attachment to the extreme. This is not the Buddha's take on enlightenment. This is like a perverse, corrupt enlightenment. So even spirituality becomes corrupted by Tyler Durden, right? He is a corrupting presence, and he is a totally destructive entity. Chapter 10. So we got shenanigans. Shenanigans is a great word. Our shenanigans are better than their shenanigans, because our shenanigans are cheeky and fun. So there are shenanigans at the Pressman Hotel. There's the urine in the soup scene, which is a very graphic scene. My apologies to those of you with sensibilities that might have been offended by this. But again, he's meant to seem like a little boy, like a powerless little man trying to do these little petty things so that he can have some sense of power. Why do children do this stuff? Why do they throw eggs at houses? So they can show they can control the society. Even though the society controls them, they can do this stuff and no one can stop them. It's a very juvenile approach. There's also the incident with the Madame and the perfume, where Tyler leaves a note for one of the rich people that's throwing a banquet at the Pressman Hotel, and the note says, "I have passed an amount of urine into one of your expensive fragrances," and she's like going through her bottles of perfume trying to figure out which one it is and accusing everyone, and she ends up falling and breaking all the bottles and rolling around in the perfume and screaming because it burns and yelling at her husband and yelling at everyone else. And this is where that class criticism comes into play, the Marxist critique, you might say, which we talked about how Marxism is pretty loaded as a concept. But nevertheless, you have this very rich woman who believes she's above everyone else. And so Tyler has to mess with her as kind of his way to get back at the people who are keeping him down or who are forcing him into a life that he doesn't want. The narrator as well. And so that's an interesting scene, a very graphic, when she's rolling around in the perfume and cutting herself and screaming. But it has to do with that class warfare and getting back at the rich, right? He serves soup to the drunk doctor. Of course, we know what's in the soup. And the doctor tells him about hepatitis bugs, which you can get from the medical waste dump if you wanted to. And the medical waste dump is an interesting sign, because it's like throwing people away, throwing parts of people away. And there's something grotesque about that, right? The fact that parts of you can be extracted and discarded, and your body has no value in that way. It has to do with the human garbage motif, a continuation of that, I think. Chapter 11, we have the escalation of the soap business. The soap is the front, of course, for the terrorist activity, which we find out. He calls it the yardstick to civilization. He gets the soap from stolen fat. First, the fat comes from Marla's mother. Okay, so that's a really weird scene. Like, Marla comes in and accuses him of cooking her mother's collagen and cooking her mother. You've cooked my mother. Not her actual mother, but her mother's fat. But again, what's the distinction between you and your parts, right? Have you ever thought about how we are comprised of all these separate parts, and yet we think of ourselves as a singular and homogeneous entity? How is that, right? What are you really? Are you your head, your heart, your femur, or are you something beyond all that? It's a very interesting idea about like who we are in terms of our relationship to the body, and not just the body as a singular entity, but the parts of the body. So for the stolen fat, I think, is a sign that has to do with this fragmentation. There's a lot of fragmentation of the self in this text. Fragmentation of body parts. You get the Reader's Digest scene was, I am Jack's colon. I am Marty's lungs, and all this stuff. That's a continual scene, and it has to do with, I think, our society's tendency to objectify people and to make people into objects, right? And that's very strange. Why do we do that? Why does society cannibalize its people, right? Maybe not necessarily people that live in the society, but like if you look at sweatshops and blood diamonds and all this stuff, our consumer society definitely comes with a human cost. And we treat humans as though they are disposable. And I think these body parts being extracted, liposuction, collagen injections, that kind of thing, is supposed to be a commentary on that. We end this scene is probably the grossest in the book, where Marla and the narrator are screaming at each other and wrestling in a pile of Marla's mother's fat. It doesn't get weirder than that. So my apologies if that made you a little sick to your stomach. I think it does me too. So chapter 12, which is where we left off for the first portion, we start with a company that he works for is actually going to do a recall, but he contracts it with the sort of the hush hush of the interiors causing defects. And the narrator's job as a recall coordinator really illustrates the sickness of consumer society and putting a price tag on human life, which is a crazy thing, right? To us who, like, if I were to say, what is the value of your life? You would put a price tag on it that's like way high, right? Because your life is indefinitely valuable to you. But that's not really the case in the world. They put a price tag on human life all the time, and this recall coordinator thing is one of the ways that they do it. The narrator also threatens his boss here in a very overt way, although he's like, well, whoever wrote this note, but he's referring to himself. This can be disturbing. You have to remember, at the time that the novel was written, none of the major shootings or anything had happened yet. And actually, when the film came out, it was right after Columbine, which was the first one of those major shootings, and it was actually censored as a consequence. But this is, again, this is Palahniuk showing you not only the mentality of someone who would do that, but the causes of their mentality. What put this man in this place that caused him to behave this way? And that is sort of one of the things that I think Chuck Palahniuk is trying to get at. At the end of chapter 12, the narrator meets Big Bob on the street, who reveals that he is a member of Fight Club. And he also talks about a new project that has been initiated that he can't talk about. And he refers to Tyler Durden as a great man. So this new project, if you think back to chapter 1, there's a good chance it's Project Mayhem. So basically what we see is that Fight Club isn't enough. It's evolving into this terror ring. And the sort of the mentality of the narrator is going for even greater extremes now in terms of his involvement with Tyler Durden and what's going on. So this whole development is a commentary on the Nietzschean overman. Friedrich Nietzsche said that in the absence, he said that God was dead. Okay, not to offend anyone, but that's what he said. Not saying that's right, but he said that God is dead, and once God dies, you lose all meaning. So you have to create meaning for yourself. You have to become the overman, the Übermensch, which is like the idealized version of yourself that can endow your life with a meaning that you create. This is also what the existentialists were largely about. This Project Mayhem, then, is a commentary on what if in the pursuit of the overman, you actually become destructive and horrible? What if your vision, your ideal self, is a terrible thing that doesn't benefit society? This is something that really isn't considered by people who value nihilism and existentialism and all that stuff. And I think it's interesting because, trusting people to come up with their own ideals, they may come up with some crazy stuff. And this is a problem. I don't know how many solutions that the novel offers to the problems that it identifies, but it does a good job breaking down our society and all of its like gross parts and talking about it, showing how everything is corrupted, from our institutions, our government, to sexuality and the way we treat each other. It's all this perverse, gross, dystopian doppelganger of what it should be, right? Or what it would be in an ideal sense. So we're going to stop there today. I will put these notes in the supplemental materials folder. There are a couple of typos that I noticed while I was reading you this, but that's okay. So please watch this video over again if you need to kind of get an idea of some of the interpretive relevance of various things in these chapters. We didn't really talk about the space monkeys and all that stuff, and the sort of the sacrifice. We should get more into that. But we have the final half of the novel to go. So please email me if you have any questions, and have a lovely week.